where you can check it out in case you missed it, or feel free to pass that word along to other folks. But again, we're very happy to welcome Ron Brown back with his very popular Around the World program. But this time we're actually sticking close to home and just traveling a couple of towns over to Flushing, Queens. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Brown. Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. It's wonderful to be back at Port Washington Library. This is the first time I'm visiting Port Washington Library from the comfort of my home office. Today, our topic is going to be the continuation of this series, which I've been doing for, in fact, a couple of years now, Friday, once a month, on the fascinating cities and locations of the world. We've done Paris, Rome, and these are all places where I've lived, whether it's Shanghai or Jakarta or Singapore. In fact, I just got back from Brazil, where I was for my January vacation. So all kinds of wonderful, exciting cities. Now, I don't talk about a city unless I've been there, so I know it from the ground. Well, our topic today is going to be Flushing, Queens. Now, you might not know Flushing. If you live in New York, you know that it is now another giant Chinatown. In fact, the largest Chinatown in the United States is now in Flushing. But Flushing has a fascinating history that goes back to the colonial Dutch times. In fact, as we're going to see, when the Dutch founded it, its name wasn't Flushing. Most people often ask me, they say, well, where's the name Flushing come from? They think of their toilet. Well, it has nothing to do with your toilet. It was a Dutch town named Vlissingen. And when the English took over, they really couldn't pronounce Vlissingen very well, so they just changed it to Flushing. Now, as you can see from the stamp on the right, Flushing is where religious freedom began in America. The outline is down on the left there, you see. We'll talk about the Dutch colony, the founding of Vlissingen. John Bowne, who's named the main street of Flushing, is the Bowne Street. Flushing, the city of religious freedom, the free city of Flushing, and then a new Flushing today. So, as Jeff mentioned, I will speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll throw it open to comments and questions since you are all muted. Now, let me see if I can get my, there we go. Okay, now, when the Dutch claimed the area which was originally New Amsterdam, they claimed a lot more than just what is today New York City. If you look at the map on the left, you see the pink part, that's Boston, and that's where all those terrible Puritans were settling. At the bottom other corner, you see Virginia, which was English, but everything in between was claimed by the Dutch. The yellow part, which is today most of Connecticut, Massachusetts, all of New York State, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, up to the St. Lawrence River, was the Dutch land claim. The gray part is disputed with the English and the Dutch. The bottom gray part is today the Delaware. So the Dutch claimed a huge area. Well, when they started taking over and building their colony in 1624, they realized that if they didn't populate their colony, the French up in Quebec were going to come down and steal it, or the English in Boston or Virginia were going to gang up and take over. They were even afraid of the Spanish coming up from Florida and Georgia and taking over. But the problem was Holland in the 1600s was the richest country in the world. The standard of living was high. The Dutch were building their empire, going to war against countries like Spain and England and the Holy Roman Empire. So basically, the Dutch said, if we don't populate the colony, we're going to lose it. So they threw open the doors to immigration. Some Dutch trickled in. French Huguenots, you might know Peter Minuit, the guy who bought Manhattan for $24, he was a French Huguenot. Danish people arrived. Did you ever hear of the Bronx? Well, that was Mr. and Mrs. Bronk who lived up there and who owned the Bronx. And so people would say, well, we're going up to visit the Bronx family. And the name the Bronx stuck. Germans, John Jacob Astor, Scots came over, Spanish, Irish, Indians were here, African slaves, New York, New Amsterdam was a slave colony. And the first Chinese came over. So the Dutch realized they have to populate their colony. Well, we tend to forget that places like Philadelphia were originally Dutch colonies. Delaware was founded by the Dutch. We have Fort Nassau, Schenectady, Beverwyck, Connecticut, Hampstead. These were all founded by the Dutch. Well, on the right, we can see New York Harbor. Back in the 1620s, there was no Verrazano Bridge, but it was a great harbor. And so all of the beaver pelts, the riches, the lumber was all being exported by the Dutch from New Amsterdam and back to Europe. So the Dutch were building a great colony. I'm sure you all recognize the name Peter Stuyvesant, the greatest governor of New Amsterdam, ruled the city with an iron fist from 1647 to 1664. At the bottom, we see Fort Amsterdam with the Church of St. Nicholas in the middle. And above that, we see a map of New Amsterdam under the Dutch. See the wall going up and down, top of the picture to the bottom? That was the Dutch Wall. Today, that is Dutch. Name remains. It is called Wall Street. The big avenue going east and west. And the picture right and left, that is Broadway, the main drag of the Dutch city, as it is until today, the main drag of New York City. Well, now, of course, it wasn't called Broadway. Broadway was a simple translation of the Dutch name, Gereweg or Breiteweg, which was the main street of New Amsterdam. Well, all kinds of people came. Now, Peter Stuyvesant, he was a good, solid Dutch Protestant. And he really wasn't very happy with these French Huguenots and Jews and German Lutherans and Scottish Presbyterians and all these weird people who asked him if they could settle in their colony. But basically, if he didn't populate his colony, what was going to happen to it? The English or the French or the Spanish were going to take it over. So he had a policy when some weird group applied and said, we have a couple hundred immigrants who would love to settle, can we? His policy was, well, good Protestants can settle in New Amsterdam, but he would give other groups land where they could settle. Here we see Breukelen, which is today, of course, Brooklyn. A group of Scottish Presbyterians decided that they wanted to come and escape English domination, and he gave them a big chunk which was called Brooklyn Village. So they were safely settled in Brooklyn, building farms, fighting off the Indians, and protecting the Dutch colony. A group of French Huguenots said, can we come over? Well, they didn't even speak Dutch, but he said, oh, all right. And he gave them a town which is today New Rochelle, which exists until today with the big French Huguenot church. A group of Jews, Sephardic Jews, originally from Spain, asked if they could come. Well, Peter Stuyvesant was pretty open-minded and accepted people, but when it came to the Jews, he said, my God, I better not stick them out in Brooklyn or Long Island or New Rochelle. I'll keep them under my thumb. So he told them, you can come, but you have to live on one street in Lower Manhattan, which until today is called Mill Street, because that's where the mill was for grinding wheat and corn into flour. Eventually, they built their first synagogue, Shearith Israel. They were Sephardic Jews, which meant they spoke Ladino. They settled on the street. and they remained the very first Jews to settle in the Americas. Well, another weird group decided to apply for membership in the colony, and this was a group of English Baptists and Puritans. Well, the Baptists were suspect because they went around preaching that anybody who was baptized as a baby is not a legitimate Christian, because to become a Christian, you have to freely embrace the teachings of Jesus. And a little tiny baby can't do that. So the Baptists only baptized adults. And until today, they are called Baptists or sometimes Anabaptists. You may have heard of the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish, and the Mennonites. They were part of the Baptist movement. Well, they applied to come over. Amongst them were some Puritans who had radical beliefs. They even believed that men and women were equal. I mean, back in the 1600s, nobody in their right mind would say that a woman is equal to a man, or a slave from Africa is equal to a white person, or a German immigrant was equal to a Dutch. And so when they applied to come to the colony, Peter Stuyvesant said, oh, I better watch out for these people. So he gave them a big chunk of land in Queens, and that is today Flushing, which is not far from where I live, which is Jackson Heights. And of course, it wasn't Flushing then, it was called Vlissingen, which is named after a town in Holland that I visited last summer when I was traveling through Europe. Well, they settled there. They built their houses. This is the Bowne house going back to the mid-1600s. You can see the sloped roof because they got a lot of snow back then, the stone wall, the shingles on the outside. This is the oldest private house in New York City today, and it is located on Bowne Street. So Peter Stuyvesant started dumping the really weird immigrants out in Flushing. So New Amsterdam started growing in religious diversity. Moravians came from Germany and settled in New York and built their church. The first Baptists built their church here in New York. Now, these are the more modern churches. But the map at the bottom shows a prospect of the city of New York after the English had taken over. And look at the diversity. Trinity Church, which was Episcopalian, Presbyterian Scottish, North Dutch Church, New Bricks Presbyterian Church, St. Paul's Church, which was English, Jews Synagogue, Lutheran Church, French Church, Quakers Church, Calvinist Church, Anabaptist, Moravian, Methodist, and another Lutheran church. So under the Dutch already, New York had a terrific variety of religious groups. Now that didn't mean they liked each other. Peter Stuyvesant didn't like very many people. In fact, the only group of people who were banned from New Amsterdam and later New York, banned under pain of death, were the Catholics. Because everybody knows you let one Catholic in the neighborhood, pretty soon they're taking over. And the Dutch realized they let one Catholic family in New York, well, they'll be plotting with the French up in Canada. They'll be plotting with the Spanish in Florida and Georgia and Mexico. Soon they will completely take over the colony. But it was a colony of diversity. Well, out in Flushing, I mean, you had these Baptists and you had these Puritans and all kinds of weird people. Well, at one point, the Dutch decided they just had enough of these weird people and they should clean house. So they sent out the troops. You can see the picture here on the left. Peter Stuyvesant sent out the troops, and he said, I decided that you Baptists and Puritan and Quakers, or no, Baptists and Quakers, yes, were just a little bit too much for the rest of New Yorkers. And so he decided to expel them. And here we see John Bowne, who lived in Amsterdam 1627 to 1695. He was being arrested by Peter Stuyvesant. Now, if you look at the picture on the left, you can see the guy standing over beside the table. You see he has one leg. That's peg leg. That was Peter Stuyvesant. He lost his leg in a battle against the Spanish and was known as peg-legged Pete because he was such a hard-headed and a stubborn person. Well, John Bowne, when he was expelled from the colony, said, I am not going to leave. I demand my rights as a citizen, as a resident, to religious freedom. Now, don't forget, back in Holland at the time, all religions were tolerated. But Peter Stuyvesant said, well, what's good for Holland is not good for my colony. And so John Bowne simply said, all right, you're going to expel me. I will protest. Well, the Quakers really got everybody upset. John Bowne came, George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, came and rallied the Quakers and say, demand your rights. At the bottom, we see this giant boulder is the famous George Fox oak tree area, where he would stand under the tree and called the Quakers to resist religious oppression. And they said men and women are equal, free men and African slaves are equal, white, Indian, black are equal. In the Quaker church, anybody could stand up and say their piece. Women could stand up. An African slave could stand up and give his or her insights. In the Quaker church, everybody was a clergyman. And if nobody had anything to say, they sat in silent expectation, waiting for God to stir the soul of somebody. Well, the Quakers really stuck to their guns. And so they wrote the famous Remonstrance of the City of Flushing, published in the year 27 December 1657. They sent it to Peter Stuyvesant, who threw it back at them. They sent it to Holland, demanding that Peter Stuyvesant be forced to recognize the ancient Dutch right of freedom of religion. Now, the document is really phenomenal because how you see the words which I highlighted at the bottom. It said, demanded freedom of religion for Presbyterians, for independents, for Baptists and Quakers, all Christians. But it went even further. For the first time, they demanded freedom of religion for Jews and Turks and Egyptians, which here means Muslims. So you can imagine back in the 1650s, a group of people demanding total religious freedom, and not just for Christians, but for Jews, for Muslims as well. And this is really considered the first Bill of Rights, the inspiration of the American Bill of Rights, guaranteeing religious freedom for everybody. This document still exists. It was burned around the edges and it is protected in the archives up in Albany. Every 100 years it comes down and it is exposed in a museum in Flushing to show that Flushing is where religious freedom began. Well, John Bowne won his case. Peter Stuyvesant was forced to permit the Quakers to stay. In 1694, they built the first Quaker meeting house. Now, they don't call them churches, they call them a meeting house. And this is the house as it looks today. On the right, we see the burial ground. Everybody has the same stone in death. Just as all people are equal in life, so in death. Nobody has a big monument with angels or elegant stone carvings. Everyone has the same marker. The furniture in the Quaker meeting house is the same furniture as existed back in the 1600s. This is the oldest church building in New York City. Well, in spite of Peter Stuyvesant's attempt to keep New Amsterdam Dutch, the English marched in, or sailed in, I should say, in 1664, and they forced Peter Stuyvesant, again, you see the picture on the left, with Peter Stuyvesant with the Dutch windmill and the Dutch flag flying, and the English ships getting ready to bombard the city. Peter Stuyvesant was forced to surrender the colony, and it became New York. The English marched in and said, "We are taking over, but we recognize the religious diversity and freedom of the colony." They built in the middle the first Trinity Church on Broadway, right near City Hall, to show that the English were now there, but they recognized the Dutch presence. The church on the right is where Peter Stuyvesant is buried. That is St. Mark's in the Bowery. Bowery is the Dutch word for farmhouse. He's buried in the basement there, the most beloved of governors of New York City. But the English, after 1664, recognized and respected the freedom of religion, which was in New Amsterdam and New York. Now, this was not the case with these fierce Puritans up in Massachusetts. They were busy hanging Baptists and Quakers and witches. This was not the case in the southern colonies, where the Episcopal, the Church of England, was the established colony. New York was an exception under the Dutch and under the English. Well, the English periodically decided that maybe they should force everybody to become Episcopalian. And in Flushing, which was infested with Baptists and Quakers, they set out Reverend Samuel Seabury in 1702 to convert these heathen Baptists and Quakers. And of course, what did they name their church, which still stands on Main Street in Flushing? St. George's Church. And on the left, you see St. George slaying the dragon. Well, Reverend Seabury, see his stained glass window on the right, went out there with every intention of slaying the dragon of Baptists and Quakers. Well, unfortunately, he didn't succeed. And Flushing remained a center of diversity and accepted everybody and anybody. Even when runaway slaves from New York City or from New Jersey or even the South, slaves knew that if they could make it to Flushing, the Flushing police would protect them. Slavery was abolished in Flushing long before it was abolished in New York City or even New York State, and long before it was abolished in the South. And here we see across the parking lot the present Macedonian AME Zion. AME means African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. So even runaway slaves were given their freedom in Flushing and the freedom to establish their own churches. Another church which was established by African Americans was the Ebenezer Baptist, founded in 1870 as once again, recognizing that Flushing was a place where there was very little, if any, religious discrimination or racism. On the right at the bottom, you see the old church dating back from the 1870s, and on the left, you see the brand new church of 1961. African Americans flourished in Flushing. We see Louis Ace Latimer, who was a famous inventor and scientist, and his house is considered a monument of one of the very first successful and well-to-do African Americans who flourished in Flushing. Even the Catholics were welcome in New York. Don't forget, Catholicism remained a crime punishable by death under both the Dutch and the English. It was only legalized in New York City after the Revolution. But even in New York, the Protestants looked down on the Catholics as being loyal to the Pope and superstitious. But by 1833, they found religious freedom in Flushing. On the left, you see the old St. Michael's Catholic Church in Flushing, and the one on the right is the present Catholic Church. Of course, there were Dutch in the city, and here we see on Bowne Street, the famous Bowne Street Community Church today, which is the original Dutch Reformed Church. And once again, it attracts people of all faiths and all ethnic backgrounds. If you look at the marquee on the left, you see Sunday worship, English, Taiwanese, Korean, and Spanish. Very typical. Flushing celebrates its diversity, and it is very proud of it being the origin of religious freedom in the United States. The Baptists went there, and once again, you can see the church which they built in 1890. I love the sign on the right where you see welcome in Hebrew, in one of the Pakistani languages, and one of the Indian languages. Once again, saying no matter what your religious background, if you are an adult, you can freely join the church. The Free Synagogue of Flushing flourished in the area. Now, what does the word Free Synagogue mean? Well, it was the first synagogue in the United States where you could sit anywhere. Now, a lot of you remember going to church and you'll see numbers on the pews. Sometimes there were even names on the pews. Because in churches and synagogues in historic times until the early 1900s, you had to become a member. There was no collection taken. If you were wealthy and you paid a high membership, you got the right to sit in the front pew. The back pews were reserved for guests and poor people. Whereas Stephen Wise established the first free synagogue, which said, you can pay as much as you want to join, but when you go into the synagogue, everybody mixes. So once again, celebrating a new type of freedom in the synagogue setting. Now, Flushing was very proud of its independence. Remember, Flushing was not part of New York until 1898. It was a city inside the county of Queen. And if we look at the map at the bottom, we see the pink part, that is Breukelen, and the yellow part to the right is the county of Queens. Flushing was a city. You see on Northern Boulevard, you see the Flushing City Hall. It had its mayor, its school department, its police force. You paid taxes to the city of Flushing. They were very proud of their independence and of their history. It only became part of New York City in 1898 when it's lost its status as a free city. Here we see the Flushing Public Library on the left and on the right. Flushing remained the center of education and had the largest free public library in the country at the time of the American Civil War. The first public school in New York City was opened in Flushing. Free education and obligatory education. And here we see the 1875 building of the first free obligatory public school in New York City. The number 7 train linked New York City and Flushing. Well, the train ends in Flushing. Now, with the change in demographics, it has become the Asia Express, but gradually Flushing was drawn into the city of New York following consolidation in 1898. Flushing remains very proud of its history. Here we see the Kingsland homestead, built in 1774, which is the headquarters of the Queen's Historical Society, one of the institutions in Flushing which preserves the unique history of Flushing. Flushing boomed during the 1920s. Gradually, with the subway arriving and buses, and especially the building of bridges, you could travel by horse and buggy from Flushing into the city. By the 1920s, so many people were fleeing congestion in downtown Manhattan, they started building these magnificent garden apartments where you would go in through the gate and inside was a beautiful open park. Even though you had an apartment with no balcony, still you could go out and you could sit in the yard. And this was luxurious living, and Flushing boomed. The Great Theater, 1928, one of the most lavish theaters. It's an original Thomas Lamb, who was the king of the mighty theater buildings. Once again, a landmark in Flushing, showing the wealth and the influence of this town, which so many people have never heard of. Flushing was the site of 2 World's Fairs, the 1939 and the 1964 fairs, really put Flushing on the map. In the middle, you see the giant statue of George Washington. I collect these official guidebooks and information. Once I was giving a talk at Port Washington Library on the World's Fairs, and the very next talk I gave on a Friday, a woman came in and said she was so thrilled to find somebody who was interested in Flushing Meadows Park, and she gave me an entire box full of memorabilia from the 1939 and later the 1964 World's Fair. I remember my mother telling me that she attended the 1939 World's Fair, coming the whole way from Middle Pennsylvania with her father, old Grandpa Beyer, going by train to visit the 1939 World's Fair. So Flushing remained on the map. Well, Flushing entered a completely new period in its history. As you probably know, the great period of immigration, the 1890s and early 1900s up until World War I, was the great period of immigration. After World War I, throughout the 20s and the 30s, and during World War II, the 30s and the 40s, and during the 50s, there was virtually no immigration to the United States. But in 1965, Congress, Mr. Hart and Mr. Cellar, came up with a new immigration law. Most American immigrants had become educated, and the United States needed people to pick the crops in California. They needed people to work in the slaughterhouses of the Midwest. They needed people to clean apartment buildings, pick up garbage, pick up empty Coke cans in the streets. They basically needed people to do the dirty work. So in 1965, the gates of immigration were thrown open. Ellis Island was long closed. Now the new immigrants were pouring in through the airports, JFK Airport principally, and an entire new population started flooding into Flushing. On the left, you see a street scene today of Flushing. Chinatown, Koreatown, Indiatown, Pakistan town, Afghanistan town. Flushing has become the largest Asian neighborhood in the United States. Every time I take the Long Island Railroad and go through Flushing, I see magnificent new housing developments, skyscrapers growing, really transforming Flushing into a whole new city. And once again, it is no longer a city of one or multiple religions. New people are moving in. I was walking up and down Bowne Street, and I saw this little green building, and you can see the red sign in the window, and it said it was a Hindu temple. Well, the door was open, so my philosophy is if the door is open, go in. If they don't want you, they'll kick you out. Well, I discovered that it was a Hindu temple from Afghanistan. Now, anybody who's been to Afghanistan knows that Afghanistan is fiercely Muslim. But before it became Muslim in the 7th and 8th century, it was deeply Hindu, covered with Hindu temples and statues. Well, a tiny minority of Afghanis remain Hindu. Well, a group of them decided to migrate to New York. And of course, what was the most diverse place on the United States, the most diverse place in New York City? Well, of course, they gravitated to Flushing. Well, here we see what I call stage one of the new immigrants coming in. And this is, they just bought a regular house and turned the living room into a temple. In fact, every immigrant group coming to Flushing or any other place, before they build big monumental St. Patrick's Cathedral or something, they start gathering a handful of Catholics, they find a priest, they pray in someone's living room. That is what I call stage one of immigration. Here we see the Unification Church, which the Korean community took over and turned the ground floor into a church with apartments upstairs for the people to live in. Step two is taking over an old factory or a restaurant and turning it into a storefront chapel. This is right off of Main Street in downtown Flushing. This is the China Buddhist Association. It was a restaurant. A group of Buddhist nuns from China rented the building. The upstairs are classrooms, and the top floor are residences for the nuns. Once again, showing the diversity of Flushing is just bursting at the seams. Here we see a Sikh temple. Sikhs are from northern India. They are totally vegetarians. They're the ones who you see wearing the multicolored turbans. And they just took over what was at one time a storefront and a little factory and turned it into their temple. Once again, a storefront chapel, which last time I was there, they had sold it and they were building their own new house of worship. Well, the third step is when a group gets enough members and enough money and has enough resources, they buy a larger building and adapt it to worship. This is the Sikh center or the Gurdwara of the Sikhs in Flushing. You can see it was an old factory, worship floor on the first floor, classrooms on the second, offices on the third, and they added their little towers and 2 plastic palm trees on the top. And so this is step 3, where they take an old factory or something, take it over and adapt it. This is another old factory. It was a textile factory on Bowne Street where they took a bunch of Hindus from India, took it over and turned it into a mandir, which is a Hindu temple. Factories are nice because they have great parking in front. Now, this one is interesting because across the street is an old synagogue going back to the early 1900s, and down the street is a Catholic church, all existing in perfect harmony. Koreans We see the Korean Presbyterian Church. Now, this is step 4. This is when a religious group gets enough money and enough members, they can build their own brand new church in their particular style of architecture. Now, the Korean Presbyterians in Flushing wanted to show that they are ultra-modern. They're not old-fashioned, looking back to the old country, and so they adopted ultra-modern architecture to show that they are full Americans embracing the future. This is the Geranium Avenue Mosque in Flushing. Once again, see ultra-modern architecture, the minaret tower, but with the traditional Muslim green dome. Now, inside, you have the mosque area on the ground floor. Upstairs is a grade school where the Muslim children can get their education. So Flushing, here again, is perfectly happy having half a dozen different houses of worship, one beside the other. And with the arrival of Muslims, remember with the Flushing Remonstrance, demanding religious freedom, even for Muslims. And you can be sure back in 1650s, nobody even knew what a Muslim was. They had never seen one, but they said, we will welcome all religions. The Wan Buddhist is a Japanese Buddhist temple. Once again, modern architecture to show that they are part of the modern world, not looking towards the past, but looking toward the future. This is the Hindu temple. Now, this was built in 1970, shortly after the opening of the gates of immigration. Well, here the Hindus on Bowne Street wanted to show that their roots are firmly in southern India. These are largely Tamil speaking. And they built their temple in the traditional style, saying, yes, we're in America, yes, we're modern, but we are also traditional. On the right, you can see as you walk in the gate, in the main entrance there is a seal. And the seal is interesting because when they dedicated it, they evoked the memory of the Flushing Remonstrance to say that that is the root of religious diversity. And if you look closely at the seal, you'll see the light in the middle, the lamp of intelligence, wisdom. Above it is a symbol of Hinduism. On the right is a symbol of Hinduism, the Christianity at the bottom, Judaism at the left, Hinduism, all the different religions are welcome in the temple. Once again, celebrating the religious diversity that is Flushing. Now, the Jewish community, this is right across the street from one of the Hindu temples, the Kasena Jewish Center, which is 67. The Jewish population is still alive and well. So Flushing is really a unique city. It has a diversity that they celebrate. And when the Hindus take their giant statue of Ganesha out into Bowne Street and parade it through the streets for the big birthday of the elephant god Ganesha, everybody comes out and celebrates this. I went there last year. The only thing that's difficult with the Hindu Ganesha celebration is they break coconuts and they spray everybody with sweet coconut milk, which is nice until the flies discover the milk and they descend by the millions. But everybody in Flushing takes their religion to the street. I went there for Palm Sunday procession with the Catholics, which is a large growing population with large numbers of Hispanics, Chinese coming to the church, parading through the streets and everybody welcoming them. With the Simchat Torah, when you celebrate the revelation of the Torah in synagogues, they take the Torah out and they walk through the streets and everybody greets them. whenever the Baptists are marching down to the Flushing Bay to dunk somebody and baptize them and welcome them to the community, all of the neighbors join and go down. And so Flushing, even though today it is simply a neighborhood in Queens, it is still very much a part of New York and American history. And when the Flushing Remonstrance is brought down from Albany and displayed in the Flushing City Hall, there are no end to ceremonies, and religious leaders go up talking about the religious freedom that began in Flushing. And many people say that the Flushing Remonstrance was the inspiration for the First Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing religious freedom, and equally important, the separation of church and state. And this is uniquely American. I mean, I've lived in enough countries where people were at each other's throats over religion, whether it's Israel with Muslims and Jews, India with Hindus and Muslims, the Chinese persecuting Muslims and Christians, Ireland, Catholics and Protestants. I mean, religious persecution is something that is commonplace, that when our Puritan and Baptist ancestors resisted Peter Stuyvesant's demand for conformity, they won their case, and religious diversity became part of American society.